June 12, 1944, near Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. The soft rustle of wind through apple trees was suddenly broken by a low metallic groan, the sound of gears ratcheting steel into place. Sergeant Charles Red Hanley of the 244th Field Artillery Battalion adjusted the sight on his 155 mm long tom. His fingers blackened from grease and cordite. A field phone crackled beside him. Then came the word. Fire mission. Coordinates confirmed. Priority target enemy bunker. Grid 6, Niner. Over. Huh. He nodded. The men braced. The gun thundered. The shell, nearly 100 pounds of steel and TNT, screamed into the sky at over 2,800 feet per second, rising above the hedgerows and villages before vanishing toward the horizon. For 12 seconds, silence returned. Then, 14 miles away, a deep rumble echoed back like a god's answer. German concrete cracked open like eggshell. The crew exhaled. Red grinned. Long Tom just kissed Jerry good morning. But for the Germans crouched inside the reinforced bunkers east of Saint-Lô, there had been no warning. No aircraft buzz, no artillery whistle. Just an invisible hand that reached from beyond the horizon and ripped the earth apart beneath them. Inside the German 352nd Infantry Division's forward command post, located in a farmhouse basement once used for wine storage, Oberstleutnant Franz Henning staggered as the blast wave rolled through the walls. Dust filled the air, and one of the map boards fell with a crash. A junior lieutenant rushed in. Mein Herr. It came from nowhere. No spotters, no aircraft. Henning stared at the shaking ceiling. He had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He knew the song of artillery. But this was different. This was a symphony conducted from beyond the edge of the map. Find the source, he growled. I want those guns destroyed. But he would never see them. The 155 mm long tom wasn't just firepower, it was reach incarnate. Mounted on M1 carriages with 8 massive tires and towed by heavy tractors, these guns could be fired, hitched, moved, and hidden before the Germans even pinpointed their locations. And now, those guns were sweeping across France. The next morning, fog clung low over the French hedgerows, but the German radio lines were anything but quiet. Reports poured in trenches, flattened, emplacements leveled, communication bunkers reduced to smoking holes. The Americans hadn't even reached visual range, yet German positions were crumbling. It wasn't blitzkrieg that tore through them, it was silence, followed by sudden thunder. 20 miles southwest of Saint-Lô, Battery C of the U.S. 191st Field Artillery Group was already repositioning. Their long tom had just fired 3 counter-battery salvos the night before, destroying what intelligence believed to be a camouflaged German 105 mm battery. Now, under a camouflage net soaked with dew, Corporal Leon Rodriguez ran his fingers over the warm breech of the gun, still humming from the previous night's fury. I used to lay bricks in El Paso, he muttered, adjusting a level on the carriage. This ain't that different, just louder. He wasn't wrong. The long tom demanded patience, precision, and teamwork. Its 155 mm shells had to be manhandled from steel crates, seated carefully, and rammed into the breech after the adjustable powder charges were loaded. Then, once the range, bearing, and elevation were confirmed, usually through maps, observers, or airborne spotting, one man yelled, "Fire!" and time itself bent around the muzzle flash. Across the hedgerows, the Wehrmacht was beginning to understand what kind of war they were now in. Not mobile, not close quarters. This was a war of reach. American gunners could sit behind 3 hills and still shatter concrete casemates with mathematical accuracy. Captured Wehrmacht, Hauptmann Dieter Krall, interrogated near Carentan in July 1944, described it plainly. It was like being hunted by ghosts. You never saw the muzzle flash. You never heard the shell. The men simply vanished. One moment, your comrade is making tea. The next, he's gone. American observers, often perched in Piper L4 grasshoppers, small, unarmed liaison aircraft, could see everything. Hovering above at low altitude, they'd circle with binoculars, spot movement, radio back coordinates, and call in long tom fire that landed with terrifying precision. From the air, a German machine gun nest was a dot. From 14 miles away, the Long Tom made that dot disappear. But range alone didn't win wars. It was the mobility of the Long Tom that broke expectations. Most German heavy artillery required hours or days to dig in. The Long Tom. Crews trained to emplace it within 30 minutes, fire, and pack up before German counterfire zeroed in. Its split-trail carriage and 8 rubber-tired wheels allowed rapid relocation, even on muddy back roads. Colonel Everett Hughes, overseeing artillery coordination during Operation Cobra, watched one Long Tom battery set up at dawn, fire 6 rounds in a 10-minute span, then move out before breakfast. He reportedly said, "That's not artillery, it's magic with a payload." In Berlin, German High Command reviewed reconnaissance photos, showing massive craters deep behind the lines, sometimes in locations previously thought unreachable. Bunkers, once the pride of the Atlantic Wall, were being cracked open from 20 kilometers away. And worse, morale was shifting. If no bunker was safe, where could a man find shelter? German officers began ordering decoys, dummy bunkers, false gun emplacements, but even those weren't spared. The Americans were listening. They were watching. They were adjusting. And the Long Toms kept firing. July 25th, 1944, just outside the village of La Chapelle-en-Jugé. At 5:45 a.m., the first wave of American bombers began to roll overhead, blanketing the German front lines with high explosives. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. But behind that aerial assault, deeper in the hedgerow country and hidden in fields blackened by rain, the real teeth of the U.S. ground push were preparing to bite. 6 batteries of 155 millimeters Long Tom guns, over 24 of the massive weapons, had been silently wheeled into firing position overnight. Crews lay in foxholes beside them, raincoats pulled tight, their breath curling in the damp morning light. Major Tom Jenkins of the 200th Field Artillery stood over a sand table with 3 sergeants and a forward observer. They didn't wear the cocky smiles of infantrymen. These were mathematicians with calluses. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment. German defensive positions had been mapped, their likely fallback routes marked, their suspected artillery nests triangulated. And now, with air cover softening the outer crust of resistance, the Long Toms would dig into the heart. "Shells ready?" Jenkins asked without looking up. "All 276, one sergeant replied. The command was simple. Fire for effect. And then it began. Each Long Tom bucked like a living thing, recoiling violently against the ground with every blast. The shock waves could be felt for hundreds of yards. Shell after shell tore through the air, arching invisibly toward enemy lines already reeling from bombs above. But while the bombs fell in clusters and spread across wide areas, the Long Toms aimed. An ammunition depot 2 miles behind the German front was hit with such accuracy that it erupted in a chain of secondary explosions visible for miles. Machine gun nests that had survived the initial aerial pounding were reduced to splinters and twisted steel. And a concrete command post, a 2-story structure with reinforced walls, was obliterated by a direct hit from a high-explosive round, killing over a dozen senior German staff in an instant. And all of it came from guns whose barrels couldn't even be seen from the front line. That morning, Sergeant Alvin Tex Dorsey, loader on Gun 3 of Battery B, wore nothing more than a sweat-stained undershirt and dog tags, despite the chill. His muscles ached from lifting round after round into the breach. But when the 3rd shell found its mark and the radio crackled back with confirmation of a direct hit on a Panzer IV formation, he shouted loud enough to be heard over the next gun's fire. That's what you get when you pick a fight with Texas steel. To the Germans, it felt like divine punishment. They had studied American artillery before. They knew the 105 seconds, the 75 seconds, even the big 240 millimeters howitzers. But nothing like this. Nothing with this kind of precision from this kind of distance. In one intercepted radio message, a German officer barked, "They are not men, they are numbers with cannons. They see everything." For U.S. forces, Operation Cobra marked a turning point not just because of the successful breakthrough into open country, but because American firepower had finally shown its full coordination. The Long Toms didn't operate in isolation. They were part of a symphony. Fighter bombers above, spotters in the air, infantry on the ground, Sherman tanks punching through gaps and artillery laying the steel bridge between all of them. By sundown, the German 275th Infantry Division was in retreat, many of its survivors abandoning heavy weapons in ditches and hedgerows. Their officers were dead, their lines shattered, and their morale buried beneath layers of earth thrown skyward by Long Tom shells. Back at the fire base, as the final shell casing clinked to the muddy ground, a corporal sat against a supply crate, arms shaking, eyes distant. He had fired nearly 50 rounds that day, each one a thunderclap. "You ever think about who's on the other end?" he asked. The gun captain didn't answer. He didn't have to. The Germans already knew. August 7th, 1944, just east of Mortagne, France. The counterattack began at nightfall, under strict radio silence. Elements of 4 elite German panzer divisions, 2nd, 116th, and remnants of the 1st SS moved west through the fog-drenched countryside. Hitler had ordered it personally. Crush the American breakthrough at Avranches, cut the Allies off at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, and drive them into the sea. It would be known as Operation Lüttich. By midnight, the 1st German armor rumbled into the hills near Mortagne. Their intent was surprise. But surprise was no longer something the Wehrmacht owned not in this war. Not when the Long Toms were watching. Hidden along ridge lines and in freshly harvested fields were American artillery observers. Some were dug into apple orchards. Others stood in barns, peeking through rifle scopes, or scanned from the sky in tiny Piper cubs circling silently above like patient hawks. One such observer, Lieutenant James Rowe, knelt behind a stone wall with a field map and a grease pencil. He watched a column of German vehicles inch through the darkness, the faint glow of exhaust pipes betraying their movement. He didn't reach for his rifle. He reached for the handset. Battery C, this is Red Eagle 2. Grid reference 293726. Column, repeat. Armored column, 6 panzers, several half-tracks, direction of movement east to west. Time on target immediate. Confirmed. Stand by for fire mission. It took less than 3 minutes. The Long Toms, positioned 13 miles away behind a hill south of Barrington, were already awake. The crews moved like a machine shells rolled from crates, powder bags selected and shoved into the breech, elevation adjusted by crank. Then boom! The night lit up, not with the flash of muzzle flare, but with the fireballs that erupted a dozen miles away as 100-pound high-explosive shells rained down. The first shell struck near the head of the column, flipping a Panzer IV on its side like a toy. The second exploded beside an ammunition truck, sending burning shrapnel in all directions. In seconds, chaos erupted. Tank crews bailed out into ditches. Officers screamed into radios, many of which were cut off mid-sentence. At an American headquarters further west, a war correspondent scribbled down a quote from a colonel watching the strikes roll in on a plotting board. "Looks like the Long Toms are playing whack-a-mole with German armor," he muttered, grinning behind a cigarette. But for the Germans, there was no humor left in the war. By dawn, their push at Mortagne had stalled. Not because of infantry resistance, not because of tanks, but because the road itself became impassable, clogged with twisted wrecks, burning fuel, and bodies buried under collapsed trees thrown down by concussive blasts. Captured German survivors spoke of a new kind of battlefield, one where every movement was punished by an unseen hand. One private, bandaged and still trembling, described it as a God's finger. You take one step and the sky tears open. There's no fight in that, only waiting. Back at the Long Tom battery, the guns glowed red from heat. The ground shook with each shot. The crews were exhausted but quiet. They didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They just cleaned the breeches, swapped gloves, and kept going. Lieutenant Rowe, still behind his stone wall, looked out over the carnage at Mortagne. What had once been a surprise thrust by Germany's best was now a smoldering trail of steel and smoke. He radioed in once more. Grid 295733. Still movement. Let's finish it. And they did. August 30th, 1944. near the Franco-Belgian border. The American advance had become a race not just against the Germans, but against logistics. Roads jammed with trucks, convoys stretched for miles, and fuel drums stacked like city walls. Patton's Third Army was moving so fast that headquarters couldn't keep up. Infantry columns passed towns not yet cleared, and tanks rolled into villages still flying white bedsheets from windows. But through all of it, one sound remained constant behind the front. A low, rhythmic thunder like distant storm clouds pacing the infantry. The long toms had not stopped. Lieutenant Colonel Martin Coulter, of the 197th Field Artillery Group, stood atop a ridge near Chimay, Belgium. He wore a faded map around his neck, marked in pencil with rough guesses at German fallback lines. Every day, the front moved so fast that his staff was redrawing the targeting grids by hand sometimes in the middle of firing missions. "We're ahead of the surveyors," he muttered, unfolding a fresh aerial photograph. "Hell, we're ahead of the maps." And still, the long toms were on the move. One battery, the 4th of the 244th Battalion, had fired from 6 different positions in the last 10 days. Their M1 guns, each weighing nearly 30,000 pounds, were being dragged across country roads, through muddy fields, and even across the remains of blown bridges, with the help of Diamond T prime movers and desperate engineers laying steel mats over collapsed spans. Sergeant Darnell Green, Chief of Gun 2, remembered pulling into a new fire position outside a Belgian orchard. The crew had 15 minutes to set up before firing on a suspected German artillery hub dug into a hillside 13 miles away. Green barked orders like a conductor with a stopwatch. Dig trails set elevation bag 3, shell he, fuse point detonation now. At the signal, the gun fired. Seconds later, the report came back. "Right on it," said the observer on the net. "Put another 2 shells just left. You're peeling that bunker like an onion." They fired 2 more, then hitched the gun, covered the ruts with branches, and were gone before the Germans could blink. The Wehrmacht had relied on predictable American habits: slow artillery deployment, static emplacements, days of telegraphed planning. But the long toms shattered that assumption. Now, the guns moved as fast as the tanks and fired with the precision of a sniper from the next province over. One German prisoner taken near Mons said, "We would hear the engines arrive at dusk, then nothing. No campfires, no shouting, no noise, just silence. Then at dawn, the trees exploded." This wasn't just psychological warfare. It was mechanical superiority, logistics mastery, and relentless artillery doctrine. American gunners had trained to emplace a long tom from rolling start to firing ready in under 20 minutes. A skilled crew could hit an unseen target on the first round, correct by the second, and move out after the 5th before the enemy even realized where the shell had come from. Even captured German artillery officers were forced to admit it in their debriefs. In one OSS report, a major in the German 84th Corps confessed, "We were trained to fight artillery by triangulating sound and blast pattern. But your 155 seconds, they do not wait. They hit, and then they vanish." The battlefield was changing, not with flashy breakthroughs or tank duels, but with quiet preparation, precise math, and 100-pound shells flying through invisible arcs toward bunkers, bridges, and rail yards. Long toms weren't just destroying the enemy. They were destroying the idea that the enemy could hide. September 13th, 1944. West of Aachen, Germany. A thick mist blanketed the pillboxes and dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line. It wasn't the eerie silence that unsettled the German infantry dug in along the border. It was the absence of movement. No tank treads in the mud. No American patrols rustling through the trees. Just birds, fog, and nerves pulled tighter than a tripwire. Then it began. Not a whistle, not a rumble, just impact. A sudden eruption from behind Hill 287 sent a sheet of dirt and concrete flying skyward, reducing a reinforced bunker to rubble in one strike. The blast wave knocked a machine gunner from his perch, his ears ringing, his body coated in chalky debris. He scrambled for his helmet, but another shell landed 50 yards away, turning a mortar pit into a crater wide enough to bury a truck. The long toms had arrived. This wasn't the first time American artillery had hit the Siegfried Line, but it was the first time it came from so far away, so fast, and with such terrifying accuracy. The 188th and 200th Field Artillery Groups had rolled their 155 mm long toms into wooded clearings during the night, camouflaged under netting and brush. Engineers had laid corduroy roads behind them, just to drag the monstrous guns into position. The moment the barrels settled, observers already stationed miles forward began calling in coordinates. Captain Neil Brodie, an artillery liaison attached to the 1st Infantry Division, stood behind a reinforced command post near Monschau with a radio and binoculars. His forward observers had spotted flashes of enemy artillery behind the pillboxes. German counterfire had started earlier that morning, probably 105 seconds or 150 seconds. The American infantry couldn't advance until those threats were neutralized. Brodie didn't hesitate. Battery A, this is Red Mike. Coordinates 227 to 456. Confirmed hostile artillery. Use VT fuses, let's make it rain. The order passed instantly. 6 long toms from Battery A, aligned. A puff of smoke, a shockwave, and seconds later steel rain. VT, or proximity fuses, were new to the battlefield. Rather than exploding on impact or by time delay, these shells detonated near the target, using radio waves to sense distance. They didn't have to hit a bunker directly, they just had to pass close enough to shatter it from above. And they did. The German artillery position went silent in under 5 minutes. Infantry officers reported it immediately. Fire stopped. Moving up, by mid-afternoon, American units were probing the outer fortifications of the Siegfried Line. Not because the concrete was breached, but because the men inside had been shaken, wounded, or killed without ever firing a shot. One GI described it later in his letter home. The shells came in so fast and so heavy, you'd think it was the 4th of July and the end of the world at once. There's not a tree left standing on that ridge. Just splinters and dust, and some unlucky krauts who never saw it coming. Back at the gun line, Sergeant Howard Moffett stood with his crew as they watched a new crate of shells being unloaded. He was on his 2nd pair of gloves for the day the first had burned through at the palms. His men didn't talk much. They were tired, and their backs ached, but they knew what they were doing mattered. Each shot they fired wasn't just another round. It was another step forward for the boots slogging through mud and wire and fire. Even the Germans, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, were shaken. Captured troops near Aachen later told interrogators that the American artillery seemed to fall from heaven. One lieutenant, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, asked simply, "How do you fight an enemy who fires from the sky, behind the clouds, and never misses? You don't. You survive. Or you surrender." And the long toms kept firing. December 19, 1944. Ardennes Forest, near Bastogne, Belgium. The ground was frozen solid, the sky dull and low, and the trees stood like skeletal sentinels watching war creep closer. The German Ardennes offensive, what would soon be called the Battle of the Bulge, had caught the Allies off guard. Panzer divisions were rolling west through the fog and snow, slicing into thin American lines with brutal force. But the snow didn't mute everything. Somewhere west of Bastogne, in a clearing carved into a pine-covered ridge, 4 long-tom guns from the 969th Field Artillery Battalion stood ready. Their barrels, dusted with ice, pointed east into the storm. Crews worked with numb fingers, wrapping gun mechanisms in burlap to keep them from freezing. Their world was white and gray and shaking from the thump of distant shells. But their radios were alive with coordinates. Inside a makeshift command tent, Lieutenant Harold Hank Levinson leaned over a hand-drawn fire map. Reports from forward observers poured in. German armor moving through Huffeleis. Infantry south of Nouville. Bastogne nearly surrounded. Target 11-7445. Hank barked into the radio. Tanks on the road. Range 12.6 miles. 4 rounds fire for effect. VT fuses. Outside, the long toms responded like giants waking from slumber. Shells arced overhead, invisible in the snow, slamming into German spearheads attempting to flank the town. One round struck a Tiger tank as it crept along a forest road, flipping it sideways and silencing its crew. Another exploded just above a column of panzer grenadiers marching through the trees, sending shrapnel raining down like razors through the pines. An American spotter in a Piper L4, circling above the clouds, watched the carnage through binoculars. "It looked like the trees were exploding," he reported. "Men scattered like ants, a whole company gone in 30 seconds. The Germans expected bad weather to neutralize Allied air power, but they hadn't counted on artillery with the reach of bombers. Long Toms didn't care about the sky. From the American perspective, Bastogne had to hold. And the only thing stopping German armored thrusts from encircling the 101st Airborne entirely besides frozen willpower and bazookas was the steel wall laid down by artillery batteries dug in miles behind the front. Some of the crews firing those Long Toms had no idea how close things were to collapse. They didn't know about the paratroopers running low on food, or the medics operating in cellars lit only by lanterns. But they knew their targets, and they hit them. Every time a German gun crew tried to shell the supply road southwest of Bastogne, a Long Tom silenced them within minutes. Every time armor rolled out to test the perimeter, a Long Tom beat them back. Corporal Eugene Walsh, loader on Gun 4, remembered hauling frozen shells with mittens, his breath forming clouds as thick as smoke. "We kept the barrel warm with fire," he said later. "Not so it wouldn't freeze, but so it wouldn't warp from too much firing." In the end, the Germans stalled. Not just because of American grit, but because their momentum bled out across snowfields cratered by unseen fire. Captured Wehrmacht logs recovered after the bulge revealed the extent of the shock. One note scrawled by a German artillery captain read, "Enemy fire accurate beyond reason. No safe rear. We fight ghosts with thunder." By Christmas, Patton's relief column had broken through to Bastogne. The sky cleared. Air cover returned. But by then, the Long Toms had already done their job. They didn't stop the storm. They stood in it and struck back mile after frozen mile. March 23rd, 1945, west bank of the Rhine River, opposite Wesel, Germany. The wind off the water carried a sharp bite. Across the river, the ruined silhouette of Wesel lay smoldering under a smoky haze. What once had been a proud German city was now little more than rubble stacked in the shape of buildings. And still shells fell. At 2,100 hours, as engineers prepared to throw pontoon bridges across the Rhine, more than 2,500 Allied artillery pieces opened fire. Among them, standing like iron titans dug into the muddy flats, were rows of 155mm Long Tom guns. It wasn't a fire mission. It was a crushing declaration. They called it a preparation barrage. But for the Germans, it felt like the end of the world. Captain Joseph Mace, commander of Battery D, 244th Field Artillery Battalion, stood beside Gun 3 with a stopwatch, staring through binoculars across the river. Every gun in his battery was registered, zeroed, and stacked with shells. The targets, bunkers, flak positions, rail hubs, artillery nests, and command centers, everything that could slow the American crossing. Fire in sequence. 10-second delay. "Walk it east," he said. The first Long Tom bucked. A second later, the next did. Then another. The sound rolled like thunder caught between stone cliffs, endless, overlapping, deliberate. For 90 minutes, the Rhine's far bank was hammered without pause. Observation posts reported concrete bunkers disintegrating under direct hits. German anti-aircraft positions, already weakened from previous raids, were erased. A panzer headquarters dug into a cellar beneath a brewery, took a 155mm shell through its roof, 20 officers dead before they reached the stairs. Lieutenant Frank Kelly, an aerial observer flying a slow circle in a reconnaissance plane above the smoke, described it over the radio. "Wesel's lit up like a forge. They're not just softened, they're cracked open." The Germans returned fire, but feebly. Their guns were limited in range and locked into fixed emplacements. The Long Toms could shift, wheel, adjust elevation, and continue the barrage long after German tubes had gone silent or were abandoned altogether. As dawn crept over the river, the infantry began to cross first in small assault boats, then over temporary bridges under artillery smoke screens. The path had been paved not with concrete, but with calculated violence. Behind every step forward, there was a gun crew sweating over steel, running powder charges and wiping soot from frozen fingers. Some German prisoners were pulled from the ruins hours later, stunned, deafened, and staring into nothing. One SS officer reportedly whispered to an American private, "We never saw you. We never heard you come. The shells just fell." Colonel Clyde Woodruff, coordinating the field artillery network for the crossing, later told a journalist, "If Normandy was the hammer, the Rhine was the anvil, and the long toms, those were the hands that swung it. But it wasn't just brute force that won the river. It was precision, timing, math, months of coordination. Gunners who could read topographic maps like gospel, spotters who learned how to pick out disguised bunkers from tree shadows, drivers who dragged the 30,000-pound monsters through mud and rain over bridges that creaked under their weight and still got them into position before 0 hour. That night, the last of the long toms ceased fire, not because they ran out of targets, but because there was nothing left standing that needed to be fired upon. The Rhine had been crossed, Germany was cracking, and the guns were still warm. April 12th, 1945. Somewhere near Magdeburg, Germany. The sun had barely broken the horizon, casting long, cold shadows across the fields of Saxony. Dew still clung to the undergrowth, and the smell of tilled soil mixed with the distant odor of burning fuel. American columns pushed steadily toward the Elbe River. The war was in its final, vicious weeks. But even as infantry units crept closer to Hitler's dying Reich, the long toms still had work to do. On a rise overlooking a flattened train depot, Battery C of the 192nd Field Artillery Battalion had just wheeled into a new firing position. German resistance had grown erratic. Some towns surrendered without a shot, while others burst with last-ditch ambushes. The Americans didn't wait to find out which was which. Their orders were clear: destroy any rail lines, command posts, or troop concentrations between the 9th Army's advance and the Elbe. Staff Sergeant Walter Buck-Rains, a Georgia farm boy turned gun chief, stood beside his 155mm long tom adjusting the traverse wheel. His crew worked with silent precision, the way seasoned artillerymen did when words had been replaced by instinct. A forward observer had spotted German movement, possibly SS, gathering inside a woods line near the town of Gardelegen. No one was taking chances this late in the game. Rains called out, "Charge 4, he shell, time delay fuse." 1 round, fire for effect. The first shot roared out. The recoil slammed back the split trail carriage. As the gun settled, the next shell was already on the cradle. From a distance, it looked like lightning without the flash. One moment, stillness. The next, trees and men and weapons lifted skyward in a bloom of black and brown. A second salvo followed, then a third. By the time the smoke drifted, the tree line had simply ceased to exist. The Germans never returned fire. That same morning, intercepted radio traffic revealed something peculiar. German commanders were struggling to convince their troops that the Americans were not employing aircraft in their artillery strikes. Many of them still believed they were being bombed by unseen planes. But no aircraft had flown that sector in over 24 hours. It was all math, all guns, all long toms. One Wehrmacht corporal, captured outside Genthin, shook his head as he was questioned by a translator. "We heard no planes, no warning. The shells simply arrived." By now, German morale was fractured. Entire units surrendered to the first GI they saw. Villages raised white flags on tree branches before the Americans even entered the outskirts. But in some places, especially where fanatics or SS loyalists took charge, resistance was fierce. That's when the long toms returned to center stage. On April 15th, during a firefight near a fortified German manor house north of Zerbst, infantry were pinned down by machine guns firing from a stone wall. They couldn't get close enough for grenades, and the tanks couldn't maneuver in the narrow tree-lined approach road. The call went up to division artillery. 2 long toms, 11.3 miles away, were brought into action. Battery fire direction calculated the distance, terrain deflection, wind drift, and fuse delay in just over 4 minutes. The first round hit the south edge of the manor wall. The second punched clean through the slate roof. The third collapsed the structure entirely. Not one American life was lost that day. The men marched forward in stunned silence, stepping over rubble and shattered MG-42s. Back at the battery, Buck Raines lit a cigarette with blackened fingers and looked down at the still smoking breach. He didn't smile. He just said, "One less family waiting on a telegram." As the front pushed east, the 155 millimeters long Tom continued to do what it was built to do: kill threats before they ever came into view. And as American boots neared the Elbe, the gunners who had worked day and night behind the scenes began to realize they might actually see the end of it. May 7th, 1945, just outside Dessau, Germany. A chill hung in the air that morning. Not from the weather, though the Elbe's breeze still carried a bite, but from something deeper. The kind of silence that comes after years of noise, after a war. Sergeant Walter Buck Raines sat on an overturned shell crate beside his long Tom, staring out at the morning haze. His uniform was filthy. His gloves were torn. His gun, Gun 2 Battery C, hadn't fired a round in 3 days. Then the word came down the line. Unconditional surrender. Germany's done. Nobody cheered right away. The battery crew didn't leap into the air or toss helmets skyward. Instead, they stood still, unsure of what to do with their hands for the first time in months. One man, Private Lasky, lit a cigarette and exhaled a shaky breath. Another sat down and wept quietly. The long Tom's barrel, blackened from thousands of firings, now pointed toward nothing. No coordinates, no countdown, no radio orders. Just the hum of wind through grass and the faint sound of church bells ringing from a village that still smelled like smoke. Across Europe, other guns stood idle, two-lined along riverbanks, parked beside cratered roads, hidden in orchards. Their crews, some barely old enough to shave when the war began, leaned against them like old friends, scarred and tired. Colonel Clyde Woodruff, now stationed near Leipzig, visited each of his battalions one by one. When he reached the 192nd, he found crews polishing their long Toms, not because they were ordered to, but because they didn't know what else to do. "This gun's been with me since Normandy," one gunner said. "If I clean it now, maybe it won't haunt me later." For many, that's what the long Tom had become, more than just steel and recoil. It was the beating heart of everything they'd endured. Every mile gained, every comrade lost, every night spent in foxholes while others slept behind their fire. In Berlin, the signatures were going on paper. But in muddy fields outside Dessau, the war ended without ceremony. As the sun rose higher, Buck Raines finally stood. He walked to the front of Gun 2 and placed his hand on the trail mount. "You brought us home," he whispered. Nearby, the battery commander walked over holding a clipboard. "Orders came in," he said. "We start pulling back tomorrow. Fuel trucks are rolling in by nightfall." Buck nodded, but didn't move. "Anything else?" The officer hesitated, then added, "We're told most of these guns will be shipped back. Stored, sold off, maybe scrapped. No ceremony, just metal again." Buck didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket and scrawled a name on the side of the breech. Anna Louise, after the sister he lost at Pearl Harbor. One by one, the other crewmen added their own marks. Names, hometowns, quotes, Bible verses, some crude drawings. Nothing official, just proof that it had mattered, that they had been there, that the long Toms had spoken for them when nothing else could. By evening, the battery sat in silence, the last shell still sitting in its crate unfired. A weapon built to strike from beyond the horizon, now resting. No one knew if the world would stay quiet. But for the first time in years, the long Toms were.